So, hello everyone. We are starting with the second webinar of the series to support ILAIPP improve their sustainability, both of the network and its centers. As you know, we had the first webinar around a month ago, centered on working with the private sector. And this second webinar is on designing a portfolio of services. Hans Gutbrod will help us go through this issue and will facilitate debate, and we share examples. And of course, you are also invited to share your own examples and experiences. Let me explain briefly the methodology for those who have not participated in the first webinar. So while Hans will be going through his presentation, there will be options for you to intervene. We will you can do that enabling your microphones, but also using the chat. And in both cases, Hans, Enrique, and I will pick up your interventions and try to answer them. Especially, as I said, we invite you to share your own experiences in terms of portfolio of services, selling your work, and so on. So the webinar is being recorded. We will share it afterwards for you to recap on it, and also share it with other members of your organization. And as you know, after the webinar, Hans will be available for one more week in the Moodle platform. I already shared the users and passwords with you. And as usual, we invite you to make use of that space to continue the discussion, make more tailored questions and queries to Hans, who will be willing to help you address your challenges. So that's all from my side. I will introduce Hans. Hans, for you to know, we have colleagues today from Ecuador to Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, Honduras, Argentina. So it's a diverse group. So I'm sure the discussion will be very rich. So Hans, as you know, I already shared his biography, but Hans coordinates Transparify. He works with research organizations around the world and especially analyzed think tank finance, and works supporting research organizations on policy research. He's based in Tbilisi, Georgia, and has been leading the Caucasus research centers in the past. And that's, I would say, the most relevant issues. I will let Hans finish to introduce himself. And Hans, it's all yours now. We will be supporting you from this side. Thanks.
Thank you, Leandro. Thanks for this introduction. And I look forward to the seminar, and also especially to your questions, everyone, in terms of sharing your own concerns and questions and ideas that you have on this topic. And today my aim is to give you my perspective in terms of what worked for us, what worked well. This is a real case. I'll give practical examples as well. But also clearly context matters, and I'll kind of illustrate this a little bit with just here where I'm talking from. I'm currently talking to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. You see it's a kind of an old city here. Go in, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. These are kind of, no, it's a little slow to load because we're on too many things probably. But it's an old city with a diverse history, and also, and this is something I'll say again, with a particular geographic situation. I'm talking to you from here, right in the middle of the spot. There's Iranian fortresses that were built by the Iranians. But it's a Christian country. And if we zoom out, and the reason why this matters is because it depends on, it's kind of the context matters for who the funders are. You see, we're kind of here a relatively very small country between big empires, between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, and around Armenia and Azerbaijan. So that's just as an illustration for relevant context. Let me go back to the presentation itself and talk a little bit about what the idea of a portfolio of services is. And I think at the very simplest, folio, of course, were large sheets, and the idea of a portfolio was carrying in one hand, so to speak, a set of sheets, big sheets that you looked at, and portfolio, therefore, nowadays typically means a range. And services, in this case, I take at the very simplest to mean it's an activity, not so much a product. Yeah, it's not a portfolio of goods. And it's an activity that someone pays for, and that's different from a grant, typically from a pure grant, because there's some kind of an idea of an exchange. That also potentially has tax implications. That's very important depending on the country you're in, how, of course, you do that within your own tax structure. But what I try to emphasize with that, and what I think the idea originally that Enrique and Leandro had, is the point that this is really we're talking about a really broad range of things here. We're talking about something that does include straight out research in various forms, but can include consulting. So where you deliver a product that's often privately held afterwards and doesn't get published. It can include convening, bringing people together to have a particular kind of debate. Can include different aspects of communications, helping to enhance certain messages, because typically think tanks are good at that. Or achieving other kind of policy impact, outreach impact, policy impact. So it's really, I think, a very, very broad range. And again, what I want to draw on today is one particular approach and my own experience in doing that. How do we generate income, the kind of income that sustains your colleagues and ideally also builds margins. So 1 second between the screens. Okay. So the point that I would make overall is that I think the solutions always depend on context, and I will illustrate this as well by highlighting that that something that worked for one of my centers didn't work for all the others. So I was showing you the 3 countries: Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So I was the regional director. I oversaw 3 different operations, 3 different offices in very different contexts, different countries, different languages, different alphabets, different political situations. So it's very specific. It's very different from, of course, I understand, from Latin America. I myself was born in Brazil a very long time ago. I'm a Brazilian citizen, even though I haven't been there for a long time. But I'm familiar that this is a very different context here. It's very specific. So the solutions are very much depending on context. But I do think that some of the principles are, I say, eternal, are big principles. And that doesn't mean that they always apply, but that typically I think a particular approach is more likely to deliver and is more likely to be successful for particular reasons. And the 4 aspects that I think matter, and I'll explain them in detail, is that whatever you do in your services, you really want to position yourself in kind of in four ways. Yeah, four things I think, in my view, are important. First, that the services you offer are as unique as possible. Most likely, they're not entirely unique, but as unique as possible. Secondly, that they're repeatable and ideally driven externally. And I'll explain why all of this matters. That they're profitable. That's kind of obvious, but sometimes something that researchers forget and your own colleagues can forget. If you're responsible for running operations, you may very well have graduate students who are, or people that have just finished who want to do RCTs, randomized controlled trials, all the time. I have this real issue of people that want to do fantastic big research, and but the thing needs to be profitable. It needs to make money, and you need to have people that are willing to pay. Now that's difficult, and I'm not at all saying that this is easy. And we've had successes and we've had failures. I want to concentrate primarily on the successes, of course, so that maybe it inspires to examine parallels that may be possible in the search for parallels. Caveat, again, I've said this, I'm not going to repeat this now, but the context matters, and the timing matters. Okay, why unique? Well, in being unique, what you look for, you look for what in business is called the unfair advantage. What is the one thing you can do better than anybody else? And yes, there may be others that also do it, but ideally you should have a really unique positioning, because the uniqueness, as I say here in my third point here, it's the uniqueness that protects you from competition. And protecting you from competition means you can keep the cost margins up. And it means you don't need to lower down against other competitors and then decrease the margins you earn. And also means people need to come back to you and need to keep working with you if they want to get something done, because there are no alternatives in that. And what was the unique thing that we decided to do ultimately? And I should maybe say a little bit about the context of the CRRCs, the Caucasus Research Resource Centers. Not a great name. I didn't choose it. It's very hard. People still struggle to pronounce it. So we're 3 CRCs. Georgia was one of them. We tried various things. So we tried, at some point, for example, we tried to sell fellowships to UN agencies. So we went to UNDP or UNHCR and said, give us money, we will manage fellowships for you, people will do research for you. We thought about writing reports on particular issues, but there's lots of people that write reports. And we didn't have any particular skill or depth in any one of them when we started. So we decided one of the things that we were doing not terribly well when a colleague and I started at CRC, but that was there in some levels, was surveys, face-to-face surveys of people. So large-scale surveys. And those are skills. Those are not things you can easily do. Those are not things you can just take two or three graduate students who will do it right in the beginning. In particular, you need to understand how to organize teamwork, because a proper survey, mostly with a few exceptions, cannot be done. A proper nationally representative survey cannot be organized by a single individual. You need a complex methodology, you need the questionnaire development, you need to understand how the psychology is of people responding to questions. You need, therefore, to understand the worldwide literature really on what's going on. You need to think about the pre-tests. You need to, I described to you the translations, the languages that we worked in. So this was English as a source language, Russian as a minority language, Georgian as a local language, Armenian, Azerbaijani in Georgia as languages. So This was, as you can see, quite a few languages that we had to manage as well. But then to understand what do those terms mean, when you go to a household and knock at the door and you ask, how many members does your household have? What's the people's definition of a household? It turns out that there was a term that people used for household, which included livestock, the cows, but not the children. But you don't know that if you don't have any particular skills in that. And so the same goes for sampling. So these are hard things to compete in. I understand that there are marketing firms, market research firms in most of your contexts who will be doing this for Coca-Cola and for cigarette companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just one example of a methodology, and perhaps there are particular aspects with RCTs or other methodologies that you can develop. The challenge was quality control at all steps, coordinating a team to do that, building a culture of quality, which meant building a culture of feedback that was kind of internally contradictory, because on the one hand, you had to be rigorous and relentless and push very hard. At the same time, you needed to encourage people to speak. So if anybody found a mistake, that they would speak up and talk about it. So building that culture, that was something unique, and it set us apart. And it also, within that context, being able to present that data and present it well and learn how to do it. So this was one thing we did, and let me just go back to the slide before, where I say, you may not have that unique skill right now. Maybe you already have it in some fields, but not fully built out. But typically, it's something that if you're strategic, you can build it over 1 or 2 years. When we started with it, we weren't so good. Realistically, we made mistakes. We spent far too much on sampling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I look at now, when I do trainings on communications, I show my own presentations as how many mistakes I made, and because the presentations weren't very good in the visual presentation. But it's something you can develop towards. Okay, so that's unique, unfair advantage. I think a second aspect that took me time to realize, unique is basic. Yeah, I mean, anybody who's doing a business class will talk about that, and it's not going to be particularly novel to people. But another question is, how do you make things that are repeatable, so that you don't have to, the essence of it is that you don't have acquisition costs. So fundraisers often say it's 5 times as much work getting a new client or a new donor as it is to get a repeat donation from an existing client. That's what people say that organize, for example, TEDx events or TED events around the world. Maybe that's not entirely true. Maybe in some cases it's more or it's less. But the point is that, as I say at the bottom here, sequels work. Doing Batman 3, 4, 5 is a really great way, because you know who your main characters are, you know how the characters, what their psychology is, you know the backstory. Star Wars, you know what the character development is, you know what the entire landscape of the other people are, and you don't need to invent everything again, and you don't need to invent all the terms again, and you don't need to pre-test the questions. And in fact, you have things that you can relate to in that you can relate to backwards. A colleague of mine said this, that surveys are like wine; it gets better over time. That's not a perfect comparison, but the point about it was, if you've done 3 surveys on an issue that relates, say, on gender roles or on social capital, you don't need to do these every year. But let's say you've done 3 surveys in a row on a particular issue on media development. Who are they going to go to for the 4th survey? Are they going to go to someone entirely new who will make new mistakes, or will bring some inconsistencies, even relatively small inconsistencies or differences will matter tremendously? Or will they just have to go to you as a repeatable thing? Yes, I see here, yeah, household surveys. Or will they have to go to you to do this? And so this is something we definitely, that definitely I think is a key advantage, that if it's repeatable, and then ideally if the repetition is externally driven. If you have to go every time and convince people that now you should do another round of the so-and-so barometer, we had something that originally was called the Data Initiative, and then we called it the Caucasus Barometer. That's expensive, that takes time. But if you have something that's externally driven, that's a great advantage. Our thing that was externally driven, one of the things we went for was elections. And this wasn't really, if I describe it as this, right now, it wasn't that we developed a grand strategy and that we sat around and looked at these 4 adjectives, but kind of intuitively we felt that this was a space we would go for. And when there was a national crisis and elections came up, I started going to all the election meetings, and at some point, one thing led to another. There was luck, this still carries on to this day. So this started at the end of 2007. So now for 10 years, I'm no longer with the CRRC for more than 5 years, but they continue doing this work. And elections are great because they happen all the time. You typically, depending on your electoral season, you have parliamentary elections. You may or you may not have presidential elections. You typically have municipal elections. Often they're not at the same time. Another huge advantage is that you don't need to go around and get people interested in this research. In fact, the exact opposite happened. In our case, initially the research was meant to be not entirely public, and it kept getting leaked all the time. So people were taking photos of closed presentations and distributing it out in different directions. And so you almost don't need a communications officer to work on this. Ideally you do, but I mean, you almost don't, because people generate their own interest. And today that's of course, something you want to do, because otherwise you're competing with cat pictures or with Donald Trump or with anything else for attention. And the advantage is that the methodology, if it's repeated, like with the movies, you have a chance of improving the methodology each cycle. And not only that, you have a chance to cut your costs each cycle. That every cycle you do, the costs get lower because you know how to improve things a little bit, and your margins increase and you earn more money. Now, profitable. Obviously, margins matter. Very obvious, you won't win if you lose money. And also, typically, obvious big budgets have bigger margins. So the problem with the report model of earning money is that reports are, I've typically found it hard to really fundraise, in my context, more than $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 for interviews and desk research. It's very hard to protect the margins, because you may have somebody who studied at, somewhere at a great university. They can write very well. They've been trained to write. If they've been studying in the British context, maybe, or in some essay system, they've been writing essays since they're 14 years old every week. And they're very good synthesizers. Maybe they're a little bit journalists, etc. So the reports get 5,000. The margin there on top isn't so big. So this was a problem. The big budgets, it's much easier to put margin into that. And the face-to-face surveys in that way are incredibly attractive. And you sell people accuracy because you have much more reliable sampling. And in our context, the understanding was that this started at $25,000 per survey. And if you're interested in more details or so, I'm happy to go into that, but started from $25,000 upwards, and often people willing to pay more. Another thing we did, which I don't talk about here so much, also because my colleagues after I left discontinued this. I thought this was a mistake, but was their decision, was media monitoring. So around elections, people often are very interested in how balanced is the media, and in particular, is the state media appropriately balanced? And some donors are willing to pay for that, not always, but in our case, it was UNDP. And they absolutely care that it's 100% right. that they can, that when they, because their logo is on it and they don't want to be embarrassed about people afterwards saying, oh, you got the methodology wrong. And so this was in cases $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. It wasn't a problem. And in our particular case, maybe this was a unique circumstance. At one point, we tried to tell them, listen, we're too busy. We just can't really do this. And we were called in and we were kind of instructed to do this and told, money is not a problem. We'll give you as much money as you want, but just do it. So that's great. People forcing you to take business. And I'm not saying, as I said, this is replicable necessarily, but it was part of the experience that you sold accuracy to people. You gave people the confidence that if they invested money, it was going to be right. You got the right results. Now, focus groups, as another piece of empirical research, is possible. It's a bit more challenging because focus groups, it's hard to justify asking for more than $1,000, $1,500, maybe $2,000 per focus group. That is hard. I think you can justify it potentially up to that point, maybe with a bit of travel. But then you have 10 focus groups. Well, it depends what you do with the transcript. So potentially transcribe, potentially depending on your client or donor, you have to translate. So sometimes we sit there with 500 pages of reports, literally like this. The problem with them is that the task of analyzing the focus group is absolutely top management task. I mean, you need really, really good researchers on this. And you need people that have a very good political nose, so to speak, and really understand how that works. To be able to tell the story and arrange it. And so your most expensive staff that most likely you need for management and for fundraising is going to be incredibly busy with the focus groups. Whereas the task of the survey, putting a survey presentation together, that's scalable. You can train and teach people to do that. The people that did this for us were earning, in a low salary context, but we're earning $400 a month, which for them was a lot of money. Or here's a lot of money, but still was junior people without Western level master's degrees. But these people can do the write-up for the focus groups. They cannot do the analysis. So the last point here is many donors either explicitly or implicitly operate with a 15% overhead notion, that they think that that's the appropriate amount of money to give to people, to give to organizations. Now, Raymond Strike, in his books on managing think tanks, has written more on overheads and how to convince donors. That's a topic to itself, how you package that cost, and I'm sure you have lots of experience with that. Core funding doesn't really teach you that experience because core funding, you just get core funding, but project funding, it's always a packaging question of how you put that in through management time or in what other way. But if your management time, if you convince a donor, we had sometimes donors say, we want a large sample size, we want to cover minorities, we want to have this absolutely right, we want a final presentation in front of a big conference with ambassadors, etc. $60,000, 15% added up on top of that. The end result was that when I left, there was core funding early on, but we side substituted that. When I left after 5 years, we had a sizable surplus. I'll say more about this. Okay, and then the last question is, are there donors willing to pay? And with donors, I think it's important to say, I think of a really broad range. Those could be companies, those could be, foreign donors, those could be potentially, and I know that's very, very, very difficult, philanthropic donors in particular contexts. I think that's often tiny and not realistic to ask for that, but it could potentially be governments or companies that are interested. As long as you're open about who pays for it, I think this is fine. And then the question, how much are they willing to pay and what do they really pay for? And analyzing that as well, what they pay for. With the British government, for example, we once did a survey, $50,000, that it consisted of one trial presentation at the embassy, talking them through this for 1.5 hours, and otherwise a 10-minute presentation in London. So that was for $50,000. That's with a sizable kind of margin in there. So here again, our experience. So this worked very clearly in Georgia. This was related to some strategic interest that people had in the context. The elections surveys are now, I think, maybe 15 or so have been done. Each of those will cost $40,000 or more, plus focus groups. So this is a really big funding envelope. And after the Swedish government, that had supported that early on, after they stopped that, the British government, which has its Good Governance Fund and which has the commitment to pay 0.7% of its, still looks like it, 0.7% of its GDP, I think, or at least government budget. I might be getting this confused, to international development, while at the same time having cut DFID staff, meaning that often they really struggle to spend money. And so this is how it works. Yeah, the Swedes after 7 years stopped, and then afterwards the British Embassy took it up. So this is, I think, for another 2 or 3 years. It's not guaranteed forever, but I think it illustrates that sometimes once a really good product is in place that solidly establishes you, you have a chance of continuing that. But again, a lot of that's on the external repetition, because otherwise people lose interest. And I say this here. So in Armenia, for example, we had a project partner on anti-corruption surveys or corrupt surveys, looking at the level of corruption, externally driven. They wanted to measure progress. They didn't see any progress after 3 cycles, total funding envelope about 120,000. Sounds maybe 110,000, between 100 and 120,000. After 3 cycles, they stopped because they said they didn't see any progress. Now, what's essential in all of this is it's not only the product or the service that you offer. Ruth Levine, whom I cite further back and who Enrique also knows and I learned a lot from in a relatively short time, has made the point that it's a relationship, that all of these things are relationships, not transactions. And I think that's really important to think about. Services in some ways is a dangerous term because it suggests that there's a direct quid pro quo when really you build up a relationship to the other side. And it's not about this one exchange where they give you money, you do this thing, and you hand it over. In particular, the reason why it's not that is because people will come back to you if you're good at first the quality, and secondly the crisis management. And those crises will happen. Yeah, this is the reality, is that the wheel comes off, something goes wrong. We had various crises, deep crises happen. In one case, in the anti-corruption survey in Armenia, someone was very tired. The donor wanted all the tables in the back of the entire survey. I budgeted too little funding for it. It was $2,000 or $3,000. We didn't have the time for quality control. They made one mistake. And the attorney general, or the procuracy or procurator general, went to the sociology department of the main university in the country and hired them to find a mistake in the report. They went through that, and this went up to the ambassador, and people screaming at me over the phone from the embassy, and full out drama, and the quality of the response and of the relationship is decides whether people are going to come back to you. That was one example. We had other examples where people introduced tiny methodological improvements into the survey, not realizing that they would change how the audience would understand them. So in describing results, describing a question, in one case they said, where 1 stands for very good and 5 stands for very bad. And in the other case, they said where 1 stands for very good, 2 stands for good, 3 stands, and changing whether you describe the middle or not changed the outcome. And it changed how much people thought, what people thought of NATO. And so you went on February, you showed a slide, and it showed something has really changed, and everyone, and the ambassadors are going, oh, the views are changing. This is a real problem. And in June, you're coming back and you're realizing it was a manufactured mistake. So that being ready for the crisis management, thinking about the crisis management, because otherwise it's a one-off. You have a one thing, something goes wrong, or maybe it goes wrong the second time, or it goes wrong the third time, and you won't sustain it. I'll say one last thing. I know we want to have time for your questions, but I'll say one last thing there as well. So what also happens is that your own team will do things. We were under these election surveys, we had very strict instructions not to comment publicly, that all the commenting was with our partner that did this. And at one point, suddenly I get an email from our partner and says, we think this person called Solaris, who's commenting on some forum in the internet, must be one of your colleagues. And so, how do you manage that? Yes, turned out it was a colleague. He felt insulted by people saying, oh, the survey is nonsense. He tried to defend. So this, if you think of services, think of crisis, and think of how to manage that crisis. Like in a hotel, a good hotel isn't a hotel where nothing ever goes wrong. A good hotel is that if something goes wrong, they'll respond and they make sure that you're okay. And I think this is really important to think about in this particular context. So where did it not work? Well, it didn't work in Azerbaijan, for example, in one of my offices. It didn't work for several reasons. First, my management time. That was one reason. I had other things to do, and you have to choose. So Georgia was a great place to work. Every time we invested money, we got more things, or money or time, we got more things. Azerbaijan was a repressive context. Some of the people that we were close to were locked up, were in prison. We could have maybe done something health related that would have been apolitical, but we just never really got the startup time and never really got into it, and eventually the donors were also thrown out, but all donors were thrown out. Everything had to go to the government, through the government, and we didn't manage to build a relationship to the government. At some point we hired someone who spoke Turkish, an American who spoke Turkish, but she didn't stay long enough. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not giving you a magic recipe that's always going to work. It won't. But in some context, it will. And in the particular context, here getting back to this, in the particular context of CRC Georgia, the difference it made is that by the time that I left, we had a surplus of, I think, $250,000 or $300,000, which for our context was a lot of money. And it allowed the organization to buy its own office. And that meant that in the future, they wouldn't have any costs for rent, and made it a lot more sustainable. So, and at the same time, we did lots of other things. We still did. It wasn't that we just saved money and didn't do anything else. We were kind of spending money as well, but we had huge amounts of activity, huge amounts of savings. And the organization 5 years after I left is going. I wouldn't do everything the way they do it now, but at least kind of, it sustained itself for a good while, and it continues to have business from the selection aspects. I personally would have built other aspects as well and emphasized them, but they didn't. That's their choice. So, summary: unique, repeatable, profitable, funding available, big topics, plus branding. And that's important. And I think many researchers don't think about that. The reports often or the things that come out aren't branded. They're not recognizable. They're not clearly there. And let me mention a few things here. The colleagues of us have done, out of the Georgian context, in another organization, the Khachapuri Index. Khachapuri is a local kind of pizza that everyone eats. And they said, like the Big Mac Index, they said, well, we'll do something similar, where because the ingredients are labor, some kind of real estate, office, eggs, milk, and flour, sort of for the dough. And that is going to give you a way of measuring inflation. It's very recognizable, and it's there again and again and again. And Comparing it to where you were in 2006 is interesting when you're in 2016. So one obvious example. The IEA Ghana had did something, the presidential debates, and they had done a few, and so people came back to them, and it was a convening function. So that's a very different choice. It's a convening function, but it's very well prepared. It's high stakes. People really care about it, and they want to get it right. I should also say, in our case, it in some cases was the government, the Georgian local government, that went to foreign donors and said, we want these outsiders to do it because or outsiders, but we don't want to do it ourselves. We want CRRC to do it because the media monitoring, for example. So that's an ideal scenario, yeah, that others do your fundraising. I think this, in case you haven't read it, Ruth Levine's and Lawrence MacDonald's 12 Steps Towards Policy Change is really good, also because it emphasizes the branding, this aspect of making your thing recognizable. I had mentioned to you this survey, household survey, a little bit of omnibus survey. We included other things that when I arrived was called the Data Initiative. You know, what does that get you? How do you do a Google alert for Data Initiative? It's not going to get you anything. It just draws blanks. Caucasus Barometer, very obvious, very easy, very recognizable, very countable, very easy to set Google alerts for. And sure, lots of people are on Twitter, but not everyone is. And so the branding, so that when an idea has success, you know it's your idea, and you can go back to your donor and say, this was what we did. That's, I think, is a really good idea. And, you know, at this point, also, I think Leandro and Enrique had mentioned various examples that you have with consulting, that organizations that participate today have with consulting experiences that you do. And various things here in the comments on these organizations. And then really what I quickly want to end with is a tool that has limited uptake so far, but I still use it myself, which is why I keep it running and pay the costs, etc. It's now a little slow to develop again. This here allows you to take a look at, it's like a Google Scholar, but focusing on think tanks. And let's say you want to take a look at, you know, what are the people in South Asia doing with regards to media monitoring? Maybe nothing. Let's take a look. And here we see, yeah. So these are Indian think tanks, and you can look and you single window, you see 1, 2, 3 different organizations already presented. Yeah, that the key thing in all of these things, inventing your own strategy, I think in think tanks, that is hard. Entirely your own strategy is hard because it's big topics, and so at least looking around a little bit, what do you see in totally different contexts? It's of course the value of on think tanks itself, and the on think tanks debates and of politics and ideas, but I think also this tool really can help you. Last step of realism. The idea that you just build it and they will come, as they sometimes say, build the right thing and people will come, that's not how it works. So one of the things that's important is sales enthusiasm. And sales enthusiasm is shaking hands. That's my experience. It's being there, the first thing. Like Nick Scott in communications, being there is the first thing. You have to be at the receptions. And I don't know how I could have sustained this at the time if I'd had young children. I didn't. But staying until the end of the receptions, being there, talking to people, shaking hands all the time. If you like that, that's good. Or if you have people that like that, obviously without that, it wouldn't happen, because that's how we got into all of this, that the conversations, and you have maybe 50 conversations, or maybe it's 20, where one leads to another conversation, that this matters. And I think it's just important to emphasize and to look around in your team. In some of my offices, that just didn't work. Yeah, we just didn't have people that could sell, and that was a problem. Second thing to emphasize is lowering costs, always an alternative, and I think various ways of doing that. And then, yes, so in policy, this is also the other thing is, I've talked now a lot about surveys with 1,000 respondents, but I don't think that's what you always need. Sometimes what you need is not a margin of error that's that small, the 3%. Yeah, that's not what you need. You need to know, in some cases, are the views 80-20 one way, 50-50, or 80-20 the other way? And sometimes this doesn't cost that much money. And so the advantage can be, in some cases, that you know how to do it cheaply. Do something that has margins of error of 10, 20, 10, 15%, 10%. It's a small sample size and can do that. So overall, I would say the strategy definitely worked. It wasn't a fully deliberate strategy in the beginning, but if I look at what were the big things that we went for, that was certainly there. In my case, it was influenced by having lots of friends who are in business and sort of maybe in some ways taking on some of their thinking. That's, I think, I spent a bit more time than I was supposed to, but, so we now have time for your questions. Leandro, maybe over for you to moderate. And again, I'm sure you have challenging questions. Maybe you want to see more details on a budget of how this worked, and if I can't answer this question today, or you don't want to ask it today, or it doesn't fully formulate today, please use the Moodle platform. I'm really happy to use that and give you detailed answers, since these are things I care about. And obviously, I think think tanks play a huge and important role, under-recognized role in many cases, and it's in everybody's interest that they succeed. So I'm very happy to share. But anyway, Leandro, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Hans, for your presentation. So we have plenty of time, and in case participants want to jump in with more questions, also by sharing their own experiences, reacting to some of the services and the topics that Hans discussed in his presentation. So most of you already know you can enable your microphones and just make more direct questions, and you can also use the chat. So maybe if I can start with the question would be, if you feel reflected in some of the services that Hans presented, but also in the challenges he shared from his experiences working with think tanks regarding the different services. So please share your thoughts. Any reaction at this point?
Leandro, you unmuted me. Well, I wanted to add some examples, maybe to illustrate some of the things Hans was talking about. And I'm going to use the experience of the Overseas Development Institute, which I think, for all the criticism one can make once you are there, or while you're there, because it feels that it isn't working. It offers some interesting lessons for think tanks that want to develop a fairly strong consultancy side. So let me address some of the points that Hans made with some examples from live in a consulting think tank. The first thing to say is that many think tanks around the world, although they don't say it out loud or don't recognize it officially, operate as a consultancy. Their business model is very similar to that of a consultancy firm, simply that they are first not-for-profit. And second, they have among their mandates and their rules, whether they're written or not, they're going to use all of their profit or all of the resources they generate and they're left with after they pay salaries and costs to try to communicate their work and to do some independent research. So they bring in their work through contracts. They might call them grants, but they are no different to the kind of contracts that a consultancy firm, a for-profit firm would sign. And consultancies, and well managed, they are sources of, first, an opportunity to undertake the kind of research that researchers want to do. So, it might be harder to get 1 or 2 grants a year than to get a few smaller contracts from a number of organizations, whether they are aid agencies or foundations or corporations or even individuals, to carry out research within the subject matter that you're interested in doing. These can be surveys like Hans was talking about. They can also be evaluations. They can be simple consultancy reports, trying to help these organizations understand what they do, how they do it, or the context that they're working in. They give you a chance to kind of build a portfolio of work around the issues you want to work on. Not be exactly the questions you want to ask, but builds a portfolio around that. They're also a very good source of overhead. So the kind of the free money that everybody is looking for, you can get it through institutional grants, which don't ask you what you're going to do with it, or you can get it through the overhead that you might get from individual projects or from a portfolio of projects. That's what you're left with after you've paid everything, after you report on everything. You're left with money that is for the organization to use as it sees fit. So, for example, at ODI, when I was there some time ago, but I know it's been going on for a while, every researcher was expected to bring in about 160 to 180 paid days. So we all had 220 days to work in the year. We had to make sure that 160 to 180 of those days were paid by a contract, by whatever means. So it could be a workshop, something, but it would be a paid day. And that would leave us about 60 to 40 days for managing our project or our teams, for communication activities and independent research, and of course for fundraising. But the overhead allowed us to do something else. The overhead allowed us to work within programs or within teams and decide that, for example, Leandro is in my team and he's a very good consultant. He's very good at delivering projects. I'm going to make sure Leandro doesn't just work 160 paid days, but he works 220 paid days. And there's somebody else in my team who has a much more academic flair. And I'm going to allow him or her to do a little bit more independent research. So you're able to allocate your resources in a more strategic way. So it doesn't mean that everybody in the organization is actually working for a client, but it means that you're using that relationship with your client to create the spaces that you want to deliver the work you really want to do. Now, there's something that is important to think about when you're working in a consultancy mode, or you're developing a consultancy arm, which I think is still a very useful concept for think tanks in general. Is a concept that was very stressed around the organization, which is the good enough approach. So you learn that if the policy audience that you have, for instance, is a minister, and the minister is only going to read one page, you undertake your research or your analysis, but you don't produce a long research report that you then translate into one page. You go straight to that one page. And the same applies for consultancy. So you have to really know what your client wants, what the organization you're working for or with needs, and you deliver that. I think we noticed this every time somebody joined the organization and came from academia, for example, or came from a much more academic think tank background or an academic research center and joined ODI. That's one of the things they would struggle with. The project will be well budgeted. The days would be allocated correctly, based on experience. But these researchers who are excellent researchers would struggle to deliver the outputs that were required, the deliverables, in those days, mainly because they were going for a product that wasn't expected from the client. And although that sounds too corporate, right, too consultancy, it's the same approach that many think tanks, some of the best think tanks, use when they talk about policy. So they think, who is my audience? What are they going to read? What are they going to watch? What do they need to know? Deliver that to them. You don't waste your time and your resources doing something that they actually don't need. So you save a lot of time. Now, the consultancy approach did create a number of challenges. Hans has talked about reputation and risks involved, but you did have to develop, and this is what a lot of people complained about. You did have to develop a culture in which everybody was thinking about business development. So you couldn't just have a group of researchers who were looking for the best ideas and grants. You did have to get everybody on board the idea that you had to bring in the resources because the organization depended on that. And that could be okay for some researchers, but not okay for others. And it's important to identify those differences and try to address those. Hans mentioned Ray's triarch, and there's an excellent video on the On Think Tank's YouTube platform of Ray discussing timesheets, a very simple timesheet. And as a manager at ODI, I have to say that a timesheet was an excellent tool, not to keep track of what my team was doing in a sense of controlling them, but as a way of learning, because it allowed us to budget our projects properly. What we were doing when we started, when I took on the management role, what we were doing was delivering projects on the basis of assumptions of how long it would take us. But by having a simple timesheet, we were able then to adapt our project budgeting to make sure that we were budgeting correctly. And that made a huge difference in the way that we were able to deliver the projects, but also in the overheads that we were getting out of those projects. So it's important to consider that it's not just about delivering those services. The think tanks will have the skills and to try to be more streamlined and good enough. It's also important to think about the kind of support that the team is going to need to deliver those. And then finally, I think a very good thing Hans was saying was talking about repetition, and making sure that you offer a product that can, kind of repeat itself after a while. You get better at it. But the same can be said for certain research methods. So, for example, we had a very, very profitable bit of work, which was a study on how we did this once for DFID. How does DFID use the research and the evaluations that it commissions? We did this once. We developed the approach to do it, and then we replicated that study in different aid agencies. So we went out to the different agencies saying, we've done this for DFID, this is the approach, we'd like to do it for you as well. So we got better with time in producing these reports for these different organizations. And it gave us excellent information that we could then turn into the kind of papers that we wanted to do, and the independent research papers, because we now had 3, 4, 5 cases from different aid agencies. And we hadn't actually spent the amount of time in the fourth one as we'd spent in the first one. So our profits kept going up. But the point here is to be very careful about how you plan your services, to know exactly where you're going to be making those overheads that inevitably give you the advantages that you are seeking. But also to make sure that you are building up a portfolio of projects that pushes you in the right direction related to your own research agenda. But to remember that it's not the same as doing academic research, as doing a report for a client, even if the client is a foundation, even if the client is a not-for-profit organization. it's still a service that the organization is providing in this time. That's it.
Thanks, Kike. I'm not sure if there is any reaction from the colleagues, but otherwise I would suggest, Hans, if you can pick the Vanessa's comment, maybe you can share your ideas on that. But I would also I also invite the others to jump into.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, happy to address Vanessa's comment. Vanessa, I think that's a really interesting question in terms of how to build out and your team and how to adapt to that. And I think it's clear that this requires a team that's, so to speak, hungry for that. Not all of that remains easy. There was a time when I would go out fundraise and I almost try to hide it from my colleagues because there was this sense, oh, and Hans is going to come with another project. And there was very limited enthusiasm for this at various points. But on a more serious level, one New Year's Eve, maybe 2006, 2007, I was sitting at a friend's celebration, or sort of for dinner. I was with my then partner, and right next to me was another lady. And I asked her, so what do you do? And she says, I'm the person at Siemens that decides the build or buy, does the build or buy analysis. So what is that? The build or buy analysis? And she says, I'm the person that decides, do we build things internally? Do we do them, or do we contract? Do we buy them from the outside? And then she talked me through this, and it sort of, obviously I realized I'd always thought things that have Siemens on them are made by Siemens. No, actually, there are people deciding how exactly to do this. And a little bit through this and some other inspirations came this question. Ultimately, you're operating on margin. So what's the surplus you have? And do we build the capacity, or do we buy it? Do we buy people that are out in the market with a master's degree that's either kind of from a very well recognized institution nationally? In our case, those didn't entirely exist nationally or internationally. So that person is somebody you buy in and is going to be often fairly expensive, and often actually, in spite of all this time that they spend at LSE or wherever else it is, they won't have the key skills you need. In particular, not the attention to detail, because very few universities teach you fundamental attention to detail for a range of reasons. And so we decided at that point, okay, we need to build it. We need to build the people internally. And then something else we did, and this happened more by accident, and because various people that talked about this had been in similar systems, we realized we need to hire in cohorts. Why do you hire in cohorts rather than individuals? If you hire as individuals for your teams, for your research team, what's going to happen is you'll have this relationship to them as a manager or as an organization. I don't know whether you can see this. Maybe you can see this. Yes. Yeah. So in this relationship, we'll have various aspects, but one of the aspects, important aspects, it's going to have is how much you pay them. And they will define that individually in terms of how they think about this. If you hire as cohorts, the reason why they stay in is because they've been hired at the same time with these people. And if you make it a really formative experience, the reason why they stay in is not, the money isn't so much the issue. So we had lots of people that were in these teams, and not lots of people, several cases where we knew people that we paid $400, $500, had offers of jobs of $1,200, and they didn't take them because they wanted to stay in the team. And that's the cohort hiring entirely changes the relationship that your internal team has. And if you think about it, there are lots of institutions that operate that way, like emergencies, some emergency services or coast guards or etc., because they don't want this kind of individualized relationship. I'm in the interview, you know, I'm testing you out. They don't want a vertical relationship. They want to build out the horizontal relationship. And that is key when your emphasis is going to be in your services is going to be on the horizontal strength of how they're going to work together. Then you have to hire, so to speak, in a horizontal way. And we spend a lot of time and effort, and some of our huge, or I'm not going to say huge, but some of our surpluses precisely on this. So that we decided we were not going to hire anybody from the outside because they typically were too arrogant, especially if they had a degree from a good institution. Not enough attention to detail, and we didn't know whether they were going to be team players. And so what we decided to do was in order to have the productive capacity to do all of this, because it's not just saying, I'm going to offer those services, there's got to be a machine on the inside that actually does it, yeah? That actually does all of this. So what we decided to do is we said, we'll spend huge amounts of effort marketing that junior fellowship, meaning some of the most senior people, either the boss, sometimes I, or the deputy would go out and market it to classrooms, even if there are only 2 people in the classrooms. Because if you're in a classroom with a guy who has lots of other people he can talk to and he spends an hour with you, you know that that person's really serious about hiring. Because they show it. They don't just say, oh, we want to hire the best person. That person, you know, that person spending an hour of their time with you, and you remember that. So the first round, we had 400 applications. We had in total 5 places. We had 400 applications. We did an IQ test, very controversial, but it's a way of determining after you can't have 400 people do an IQ test, but 120. Yeah, you put all of this, not applications like CVs, but people filling out a Google form. That's something you can go through relatively easily. CVs, you're going to be dead. Your organization's done if you have to deal with 400 CVs. There's no way I mean, or at least your human resources, whoever's doing that, they're gone for 3 weeks. They're going to go crazy. So Google form, 400 people invited, 120 people take the standardized test. Out of those standardized tests, yes, IQ test, intelligence test. Why? Because that's what you're looking for in researchers. We took Raven's matrices test. That's a kind of standardized IQ test, nonverbal. Why? Because it's the key thing you're looking for in a researcher, to distinguish between a plausible pattern or a pattern that looks plausible but is wrong, and the actual pattern. That's the key quality you're looking for, to the ability to discriminate between those 2 things. If you can do that, that's great. Then after that, I don't want to spend too much of the time on it, but still just to walk you through the process, because it mattered for the production unit that was set up for those services afterwards. Then in the first time, we spent 2 weeks afterwards, realized 1 week was enough, training them every evening from 5 to 9 o'clock, and every evening, no break. Because what attention to detail is persistence, ultimately. Lots of people could have attention to detail. They just decide that not to mobilize their muscle for it, so to speak, not to fully get engaged. But if you have to go every week, and you may have another job, or someone in your family has a funeral, or somebody's getting married, or the babysitter is gone, but if you really care, you're going to turn up for 7 days. And that's actually quite hard. It sounds simple, but for 7 days, spent every evening at work or in a work context, that's quite hard. And then in the end, we gave them and in those, every evening, we taught them a key skill, because we thought, we've already taken out of the 400 people, we've taken the brightest. So 30 people in the training, if those go to other places, they will understand sociological research afterwards, and they'll be consumers, and they'll go work in ministries or work in other institutions. And we just need to make sure they have a great experience, even if they don't get it, so that they have a good memory. They like us. Yeah? So we did this. In the end, asked them to hand in an essay that they had 24 hours. They got a question, had 24 hours to write it, so often needed to work through the night. In the first year, only 12 actually handed in, or maybe it was only 11. Yeah, And out of those 11, we ended up hiring, because for various reasons, we ended up hiring 7 because they were so good. Many of those people we still work with, including one person at Transparify that we hired that kind of walked in off the street, who at the time was 19 and happened to be brilliant. We still work with them 10 years later. Why is that so important? Because the experience was so formative of getting in there. Compare that experience and the origin myth that you have. The story of how did you come to work at this institution? Well, your friend is going to say, well, from somewhere else is going to say, well, I applied, I went in, I sort of had the interview, then I had another interview. Okay. Versus saying, well, there were 400 people. I got through the first lot. I got through the second lot. I went every evening. It killed me. And in the end, they looked at my essay, and maybe in some cases, we still even had a small interview, because we said there are 4 things we want. They have to be smart, obviously, because otherwise it doesn't work. They have to be persistent, otherwise they won't have the attention to detail. We already filtered that out by getting them to jump through all of those things. They have to also be good team players. And that you find out in a week of having these people around. You see how they interact. Yeah, you see whether they're team players or not. And in almost all of those cases, we practically didn't make an error in hiring. So what did we do? We spend a lot of money up front, if you will. That was heavy. It's cost a lot of time. We were there in the evenings, and on Sunday evenings and Saturday evenings teaching them. It's a big upfront investment. But the point about that afterwards, the people were at a relatively low salary level. They were young as well. So for them, it's a great deal, because they have some of the best experience in their life. They have an apprenticeship. People care intensely that they get things right, because it's everything they get wrong, I need to fix. So I really want them to do this properly. And you have people that really have those horizontal skills. And Vanessa is sort of getting to your questions. That was one of the important changes. And here's the other thing. Those people, there's a lot of people in the research environment that ultimately are, could be selling soap or could be doing, but somehow that's where they ended up. It's path dependent. But those kids, they're so enthusiastic. And it's true, it's a genuine motivation. That's why they're there. And you reinfect your entire organization from the bottom up. So even if you have some older people that before were going, yeah, well, it's a job, I got the job, this, I see your comments, yeah. Somehow having all of these young kids around who are super excited about this, it's infecting them. It changes them. And people go, hey, wow, this is a cool thing, and it's kind of, you do this together, and it breaks you out of the solitude that, I'm now drifting into a totally different topic, but there's some people that say that a lot of the PTSD, this post-traumatic stress disorder, yes, there's a physiological component, but also some writers are making the argument, actually, it's people worked really closely together. That's how humans lived for thousands of years. And modern society rips them apart, puts them in apartments, and they don't really reconstitute the experience. They get it a little bit in specialized circumstances. They come back and they can't readjust. And so a little bit of this kind of making sure that it's not just something which is a transaction experience, it's really genuine on the inside, is what worked for us. I can't say it's going to work for other people. I know the contexts are very different, but think about really think about the production unit and how you build it up on the inside, so that you don't have escalating costs, and then have the money that you can reinvest in doing the good things that you're really there for. Sorry for the very long speech, but I hope it kind of took you to this point of the costs of the production, which I think are critical. I'll add one more thing to keep it super brief. One key technique, absolutely key in my mind, is lessons learned exercises. If people are interested, I can say more about this. My handbook has 5, 6, or maybe 8 pages on it. The handbook, I think, is still out on coupon for free with politics and ideas. It's of course going to be free for participants here, so you can download it. And it talks about the technique that we found absolutely transformative in terms of quality control. Leandro, back to you.
Thanks, Hans. So we have 10 minutes ahead. So in case the colleagues want to share their experience, what they think about what Hans has been sharing so far, any reaction? So just to support what Enrique and the others were saying in terms of you need to align your services with your internal capacities. Very recently, we, as part of an think tank's work, we were supporting the setup of a think tank in Timor-Leste, in Asia. One of the main things that we need to advise on was what would be the services and activities that this Policy Research Institute will deliver. At some point, this is supposed to be an institution that will be set up from scratch. Our advice was, of course, choose a couple of services that you're sure you can deliver with a certain minimum of funding and initial staff, and then you can build incrementally on that. So maybe as a think tank, you can start, of course, with research and support government in a couple of topics, but then maybe you don't have the capacity to deliver capacity building work. So maybe you will need to wait for that, and also for policy, if you want to sell policy evaluation services. Okay, this is something that you might want to do. You can sell that, but maybe you won't have that capacity at the beginning. So maybe you can plan this in the midterm. So that is to support the alignment between what you want to sell and tell the audiences and the market you are doing and your internal capacity in terms of staff and resources. There is a new question from Vanessa here. She says that she agrees that lessons learned are crucial, and he posed a question to the participants: who among the participants is trying to set up a new service to offer? Maybe you can share your burning doubts about it. So, well, just in case you are a little bit shy, I can say, if I'm not wrong, ACS is trying to set up an online capacity building service, or just in case Pablo want to share something on that process. And of course, what about the others?
Hello. As Leandro mentioned, we are trying to sell some online courses, but the main doubt that we have at this time is it needed to have like a market survey or something before launching this initiative, or is it better to have it done and then see results and have improving it? But at this time, this is where we are, and how to start. Actually, it's how to start, where to start.
Great. Yeah, Hans, just unmute your.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I obviously don't know your context and your previous thinking on this. You know, my real experience in all of this is that that a lot of that really develops quite dynamically, and what I mean with that is that the best thing. The best thing is if you already have existing clients for something in a small way, and then try and test it out and expand a little more and develop it that way, rather than spending a lot of time planning and then finding out that the clients aren't fully aligned. Yeah, and so this is, for example, right now my experience with a lot of these trainings. Yeah, so I have a kind of relatively big idea of what I want to do with those trainings on communications. My ideal is that I would like to convince the government in the country where I'm currently, in Georgia, that they make part of the civil service entry examination that you have to take a communications exam. Yeah. Now that sounds, in principle, is like, in my view, would be a super simple idea. The EU, the European Union, does something similar, and the point about it is not that that they're all going to be amazing communicators, but that they avoid the biggest mistakes. And the exam isn't going to tell people whether they're going to be great or not great, because maybe they can copy things, etc. But it forces people to think about communication 5 or 6 hours before they get in, so that you don't have to do the training afterwards. And the expense is shifted to the applicant rather than the training institution, and. So this is my goal. But what do I really do right now? Is it a full-time goal? No, it's not. What do I really do about it? Well, I do trainings here or there, and I have conversations, and then it turns out that at one of these conversations, somebody says, this is literally how this happened. This week says, look, UNDP is going to put out a call for $100,000 for organizations to support the Civil Service Bureau that does all that hiring. So this kind of try and have the smallest possible sellable unit. And there's of course a lot of startup lingo. Some of it is very evangelical and like religion and kind of a little silly. But what people call often this minimum viable product, MVP, the smallest viable unit where people get interested, and try and push that out and learn from that. I think this is what I typically would recommend. We had some grand ideas that where I think we made a mistake not to do it. Yeah, so at some point we realized that we had 2 native English speakers in the team of 30 people or so, and we spent huge amounts of time kind of fixing things. And so we said, okay, every little bit that they get better in their English is going to save my time. And so we got a guy who did fantastic lessons online, using Moodle actually, and fun quizzes, and they were great and entertaining, and he was Irish, and people loved it. Yeah. And what we should have done with that is take the smallest possible unit and try and sell it outwards. We also had many other things to do, and we earned much more money with surveys, so maybe we shouldn't have done it in the first place. But it was totally a sellable product. Yeah. The only problem was we had done this entire course, and then instead of saying, hey, tiny modules, and we kind of will get people engaged. So this is typically what I would do. And if you ask successful professionals that sell things, I think they in many cases will tell you it's really this kind of existing relationships. You start with something super small. Maybe you do a favor to someone. They come back and say, I want more of this. And then they come back and say, hey, could you maybe, have this problem over there? Could you maybe help me with this problem over there? This is what I would typically try and do. Sometimes it also makes sense to develop something entirely yourself, etc. So, it's just one idea. Enrique, maybe you have some things you want to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, there's another thing. For years, we have provided some services, but we have done it for free as part of a project or something. How can we change this mentality and to even for us and also for our clients or stakeholders that at this time we are in position to ask for payments for all the services. It is kind of difficult for us to make that change.
That's very difficult, and it's not something that we succeeded, and we thought about it. It didn't make sense at the time to shift. What we try to do is that we put a price tag. This is not a new strategy. So what I'm saying here, you'll find this even if you Google around for 3 minutes, you'll find this. But we try to start putting a price tag on things. and say this is what it costs. And ideally, especially if you still have a bit of core funding to kind of, that you have a runway, as people call it, and you tell people this is what the price is. Fortunately, thanks to the generous support of X, you're subsidized. And then maybe at some point start kind of trying to actually have people begin to pay for it. This is what American universities do. Yeah, I was sitting at a conference in Armenia 3 weeks ago, sitting next to the provost of USC, University of Southern California, who told me, well, yes, right now their costs were $80,000, $70,000 a year, something totally insane. Yeah, this is, I mean, absolutely kind of jaw-dropping. He said, yeah, well, the reality is that they had found that if you jack up your costs, if you increase your costs, the applications increase, because people think they have no other way of evaluating the quality. He said this is one of the theories. He said that not the only theory. They have no other way of evaluating the quality, so they think the expensive thing is the most worthwhile. And then afterwards, you offer the discounts and you give people the financial aid, and you do it that way. And you could do it with segmentation. Try and, for example, say, okay, it's for free for NGOs or CSOs, and other people pay. But the thing where I would start is with psychology, that you give people a sense of this is what the costs of that thing will be, and then potentially to ease into it. This is also a way of doing it. You may still have the funding, but then one step I would consider doing is to say any proceeds will be given to charity. So at some point, actually let people pay and let the first proceeds go to something totally different. So, but that people already have the psychology of handing money over. The key thing, if you have a chance, I don't know how this works in Latin America, but go look at how people get blood donations. They're incredibly good, because they figured out at some point that the challenges of money and dealing with money and these transactions and what these transactions mean psychologically and how little things can be optimized. And of course, the moment you start charging money, then the quality of your coffee matters, because people are going to say, hey, I'm making up a number, I paid $50 for this, and coffee is just Nescafe. That can't be right. So I would experiment, and I would do it on a very low level, and I would experiment with psychology first rather than actual transactions. But I'm sure Enrique has lots of ideas on this one.
I would add that to ease if I can, this is an important question, how to ease into the mode of charging, but also getting people to pay for things. I think one thing to do is to assess the real cost of what you do. And that was my point about timesheets. Even if it's not a tool to control your staff, it's an excellent tool to know how much exactly is costing you what you deliver. So have a real sense of the true costs of what you're doing. The second thing is that one way to start to signal to your usual funders or clients that you're not going to be doing too much stuff for free in the future is to use this costing to suggest ways in which you can evaluate your relationship with them. So, for example, something we used to do, and I do now, when the funder is not going to cover my full costs, my true costs, but I consider that we still have to do certain activities, I will do them because I'm used to doing them. It's okay. That's I've been taking in the loss in a way for a long time. But then I will make sure that the contract says that we share the intellectual property on the outputs. So, for example, I'll say you can keep the Spanish version, but I will have full control over the English version, and we both have to mention each other. or I will produce a series of events to launch the report, which you're not willing to pay for, but that means that I can then use the study in any way that I see fit. I'll let you know, but I share that intellectual property with you. So I make explicit in the contract that we are making a contribution, and I quantify that contribution in the contract as well. So my client pays 100, but because this costs 115, I make sure that those 15 are mentioned in the contract. This, in a way, symbolic. You know, I'm not going to go around the client. You know, I have a good relationship with them, but it starts to signal them that I am paying attention to how much things actually cost. And since they're not willing to pay for them, I'm fine, because I'm getting something in return. I'm gaining something for the organization that I can use in the future. So I found it a very useful and friendly way of changing that mindset from those who are providing the funding. But it also improves the relationship with them. It means we're now partners rather than just a client. There's a client relationship.
Yeah. So we are almost on time. Hans, do you want? Sorry. Do you want to say something, Hans? Yeah.
No, just to thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the questions, and again to welcome that you ask any questions, both on the Moodle platform right now. So you have this week. You're most welcome if that, you know, it's great if you ask it now because everyone's on the platform, but also just to say, you know, I'm really substantially interested on these things. I'm on Twitter. You can ping me on Twitter if you have a quick question. You know, I think I typically am relatively good at answering. And if I don't answer the first time around, you do follow up, because these are questions I very much care about. And again, on the internal communications, if it's useful, feel free to kind of download my handbook and also give it to colleagues still. Yeah, this is available. So hope that this has been useful, and that the further engagement remains useful now on Moodle and beyond. Thanks, Leandro, and Enrique for the invitation.
No, thanks to you, Hans. So before closing, I just wanted to say, I was thinking about this, that if you want to innovate in the service that you saw, you need to consider the possibility of not being successful or failing. So when you put, that's why you need to start small and see how your audiences react. So on think tanks, we are also trying to innovate in the services we sell. So for instance, the capacity building offer, it's 2 years now that we are trying to, the course participants pay themselves besides some partnerships with donors. And this is something new for us, and we are learning by doing and see and try, you know, to reduce extra costs, to cut non-useful tasks and resources. So it's as Hans was saying, it's good to have some core funding that can push you in the very beginnings. Just to make that remark. Okay, so just reading Jorge's final comment. Yes, in the meantime, as Hans says, you can continue in the Moodle platform. We will share a kickoff message and to open the space, and you have the entire next week to connect with Hans, and also between you, because you might have very interesting experiences to share. We will upload the recording very soon, and also Hans' presentation. And for those interested in the book that Hans is saying, we can share the link too. That's all from our side. Thank you very much. We will share the invitation to the third webinar of the series very soon. And great, see you in the Moodle forum. Thanks. Thank you very much, Hans. It was very interesting. Thanks, Kike, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.